been talking about the fusion of hydrogen inside the cores of stars. You might be rightly wondering how we know all of this. How do we know that that's hydrogen inside there? And how do we know that it's helium? And how do we know that there's all of those other elements inside those stars? Well, one of the core principles of science is that we assume the observations and conclusions that we see on Earth can be applied to things outside of our Earth. So today, we're going to be looking at spectra. We will define emission and absorption spectra, and we will use those definitions to apply towards our sun and other stars to determine what they are made of. Now, at some point in time, I'm sure you have seen a rainbow. A rainbow is created when white sunlight travels through water droplets in the atmosphere. White light is simply what we call light, such as sunlight, that contains all of the wavelengths of the visible spectrum in roughly equal amounts. Remember, visible light is the tiny part of the electromagnetic spectrum that our eyes can detect, typically between about 400 nanometers and 750 nanometers in wavelength. To be clear, color is the eye's perception of different wavelengths of electromagnetic light. It's how our brain interprets the wavelength. Light itself does not possess color. So when we say something is green, the light itself is not green. It is just our brain taking that wavelength of light and saying, this thing is green. Light entering a water droplet is refracted. It changes direction. Different wavelengths change directions in different amounts. So the smaller a wavelength, the more light bends. Now Newton, of course, was the first to show really that white sunlight could be refracted through a prism to produce the same spectrum of colors that we see in a rainbow. So there are two terms that we are going to use to describe this spectrum. The first one is continuous. A continuous spectrum is simply one that has all of the colors fading into the next. There is no definite line where blue ends and green begins. This type of spectrum is also called an emission spectrum because what you are seeing is the direct radiation emitted by the source. In the case of the sun, light is emitted at almost all energies in the visible spectrum, which is why you see all of those colors in the sun spectrum. So if you don't already have one, go get a spectroscope and make sure the lights are turned off in the room and point the spectroscope towards the sunlight, not towards the sun, but towards the sunlight. Never look directly at the sun, ever. On the worksheet, use colored pencils to draw the spectrum as you see it. Pause the video and go get a spectroscope and look at the spectrum of the sun. Now that you've looked at the sunlight, let's pause this video again and view an incandescent light bulb with a spectroscope. Make sure that the overhead lights are still turned off and focus on that light bulb. For a light bulb, it might be easier as well to reflect it off of a white surface. Sometimes the light bulb doesn't necessarily heat very evenly inside there. And so sometimes it's easier to just look at the reflection. But do the same thing. View the light bulb with a spectroscope and then draw the spectrum that you see with colored pencils on your worksheet. So incandescent bulbs contain a metal filament that gets very hot and glows when current is made to flow through it. So light produced from objects like this create a spectrum of colors that is smooth and follows kind of a bell curve. So around 5,000 degrees Celsius, an object looks white because the spectrum centers around the yellow, with lesser amounts of green, blue, purple, and smaller wavelengths. So why do you think that the sun and the light bulb both produce the same spectrum? Now let's turn on the classroom lights and let's look at those with a spectroscope. Pause the video and draw your observations on your worksheet. So what is similar about the lights and the sunlight? Looking at the lights themselves, they certainly appear to give off a white light. Do you have all of the colors in your spectrum? It would make sense that all the colors together would form a white light. What is the difference? The spectrum is not continuous. The spectrum is made up of individual lines at each color rather than a full continuity. This is because these types of lights produce light in a whole different way than the sun does. The inside of the bulbs are coated with minerals called phosphors. These materials absorb energy that is given off when electricity passes through the gases inside the tube. The phosphors do not make a continuous range of colors, but emit colors at different regions of the spectrum. So to get white light, they must emit red, green, and blue. This is enough to make white. Now consider another spectrum. Inside this glass tube is hydrogen gas. When we send electricity through the tube, the gas glows, just like it does inside the bulbs of the classroom lights. Notice, however, that the light given off is not white. It's more of a pinkish color. This is the color of hydrogen gas when it's heated. This is the most common color in the universe. Stop for a second and think about what it's going to mean for your spectrum. Do you think that when you look at the light through the spectroscope that you will see a continuous spectrum? So clearly this is not a continuous spectrum, or even a spectrum that will form a white light like our classroom lights. However, it is still representing a visible radiation that has been separated into its constituent colors. What you will see is that the pink color of the hot hydrogen is coming from 3 distinct wavelengths. We see violet, teal, and a red line in our spectrum. These 3 wavelengths together form the pink color of hydrogen. So pause your video and record these lines as observations on your worksheet. It might be helpful to go back and look at the lines that you drew for the classroom lights in order to get an approximate location for the colors represented here. If hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe, it would follow that helium is pretty close. Now heat up helium. We can see that it gives off a kind of light, peachy kind of color. It is actually fairly close to white light. And what spectrum would you think that we would be able to see through the spectroscope? We get a spectrum that has a lot of those colors of light. But notice that that yellow one in the center is very, very much larger than the other ones. This is where that peachy color comes from. So while our classroom lights had all of the colors of the spectrum in those single lines, this has all of the colors of the spectrum, but one of them is definitely a dominant color. So pause the video and record these lines as observations on your worksheet. It might be helpful again to go back and look at those classroom lights to see where those colors line up on your number line. Now it turns out that every element emits a unique emission spectrum. Think of this like a fingerprint. Hydrogen, for example, will always show the same emission lines. Conversely, if you pass light through a spectroscope and you see those same lines that you would see in pure hydrogen sample, then you can safely say that there is hydrogen present. This is why we can be certain that the sun is made up of hydrogen. We can point a spectroscope towards the stars and see which emission lines are produced, and then compare them to our known elements. A similar spectrum is produced when light shines through a gas. However, in this case, certain colors or wavelengths are absorbed by the gas. So you have a continuous spectrum with black lines where that particular wavelength is absorbed. These black lines occur at the same wavelengths as the emission spectra bright lines. So an emission spectrum shows the bright lines at certain wavelengths, while the absorption spectra shows black lines at those same wavelengths. So this is a picture of our sun's absorption spectrum. The black lines in the sun's spectrum are caused by gases on or above the surface of the sun that absorb some of the emitted light as it passes through the gas. By comparing the lines here and the lines of each individual element, we can determine which elements are found in the sun. So that was a lot of information in a very short amount of time. But you should be able to define emission spectra and absorption spectra, and you should be able to interpret an emission or absorption spectrum to determine the composition of a star.